Hello and welcome to this morning's session. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the First Nations peoples' lands on which we are zooming in from today. I'm in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, where I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend those respects to the elders and custodians of the lands that you are each on today too. My name is Indigo Holcombe-James, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow in the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society at RMIT in Melbourne. My research focuses on digital inclusion, participation, and transformation within the creative and cultural sector. So I am delighted to be here and chairing today's panel, which is called Grappling with the Pandemic: the role of research in federal arts agencies in Australia, Singapore, and Canada. We are all so aware of the impact that the pandemic has had and continues to have on the arts. Unprecedented doesn't really begin to cover it. With institutional doors closed, artists, practitioners, and audiences all made the pivot to digital. And I can feel you all rolling your eyes at that much overused turn of phrase. We've seen phenomenal innovation in this move online. Institutions and artists have well and truly risen to the challenge and kept us entertained and engaged while we sheltered indoors. But this has come with a price. Revenue is uniformly down, and while arts work has always been precarious, this precarity has been further entrenched over the last year. I think we all have questions about the need to reimagine business models and how we might monetize and measure digital arts engagement more effectively. We've also seen enormous disparities across the sector. Differences in digital inclusion, for example, have meant that not all artists and institutions were able to make the digital pivot, whether at all or to the same extent. These digital divides have concerning implications around who is being left behind and what will be required to ensure they can catch up. Amongst all this turmoil, federal arts agencies have played a critical role. They have tracked shifts, implemented financial and technical support, and been key to advocating within government for the sector's necessity. As vaccines roll out and restrictions hesitantly lift and physical services slowly resume, federal arts agencies and the research that they facilitate will continue to be crucial for the sector's recovery. Today, more than 12 months on from the initial COVID lockdowns, it's this context that our panel is responding to. Specifically, our panellists will discuss today the need for and the role of research to measure the economic, cultural, social, and regulatory impacts of the pandemic across three different national contexts of Australia, Singapore, and Canada. We're also interested in the policy changes demanded by new digital contexts for arts engagement and what new research questions and methodologies these changes are requiring and will require into the future as we measure digital cultural engagement over the coming years. So to introduce our brilliant panellists, from the Australia Council, we have Rebecca Mostyn. Rebecca is the Australia Council's Director of Research and Knowledge Management, where she oversees the delivery of in-house and commissioned research and evaluation work. From Singapore's National Arts Council, we have Dr. Sharon Chang, who is concurrently the Arts Council's Chief Research Officer, as well as the Research Director of the Culture Academy in the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. Sharon is an economist with current research interests, including measuring the impact of community arts, arts education, cultural tourism, wellbeing, and social capital. And finally, last but very much not least, we have Gabriel Zamfir-Enache, who is the Director of Research Measurement and Data Analytics at the Canada Council for the Arts. Gab has over 20 years experience as a management analyst and is particularly interested in questions around economic and social value, methods for measuring the value of cultural capital, and new perspectives on accountability within arts organisations. So today, each panellist will speak for a maximum of 10 minutes with some opening statements about what coronavirus and the pandemic has been like in their country. I'll then raise a few questions on the issues and themes that emerge, and following that, we'll open the discussion up to the audience. I'd like to invite you to ask questions through the conference platform's Q&A function. You can write these whenever you like, and I encourage you to write them as you think of them, but we won't actually turn to them until that section of today's panel. We'll do our very best to answer as many as possible, and remember that you can upvote or like questions to move them to the top of the list. So we'll try and do the most popular ones first. Please also bear with us if there are any technical glitches. If you do encounter any, let us know via the platform's Q&A function. We've got a wonderful tech support team on hand ready to help us figure everything out. All right, now with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's get into it. Sharon, would you like to begin? Sharon, you're on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Good afternoon. Well, there I am in Singapore to everyone. Let me start with a quick recap of how the pandemic was for us in Singapore last year. My Prime Minister summarized it best when he labeled this pandemic the crisis of a generation. In Singapore, we survived the shocks of the 2003 SARS virus and the 2008 Asian financial crisis, which were respectively and singularly health and economic crises. But into it, COVID-19, a public health crisis, very quickly snowballed into an economic, social, and even political problem. Countries took umbrage at being associated with the disease and subsequent variants, and the sensitivities remain today because they have the potential to jimmy wider traditional societal risks of race and nationality. We in Singapore are particularly vulnerable because of our smallness, openness, and dependence on international trade, tourism, and talent flows. We can see from this chart how the economy sputtered and tanked in the middle of 2020, even as the infections spiked. There's a little hill that you see on the back chart. In Singapore, just as in other countries, sectors such as aviation, tourism, retail, manufacturing, and construction struggled with falling demand and disruption to their operations as a result of the various governmental measures to contain the spread of COVID-19. Without tourist flows, sectors such as retail and transport, which had to rely on local residents, and with a prolonged lockdown, the effects on GDP are amplified. And for us in Singapore, with almost 6 million people packed into 730 square kilometers, only half the size of London, you can imagine what a challenge enforcing safe distancing would be. And with enforced lockdown, the stress of job uncertainty, of infections, without travel to relieve anxiety, Singaporeans are great travelers, mental being became a key area of concern. Zooming quickly into our cultural sector, pre-COVID-19, the cultural and creative sectors were already characterized by fragile organizational structures and working practices. This was quoted in a report by IDEA Consult et al. 2021. The fragmented organization of value chains, the project-based working, and the not well-protected intellectual property IP-based revenue models were weaknesses. So although this report was written about the EU, I'm sure that all of us, Australia, Canada, and Singapore, recognize this familiar tune. And since the COVID-19 pandemic hit Europe in spring 2020, it has been noted by the report writers that the culture and creative sectors have been among the most negatively affected sectors. As I said earlier, the containment measures that have been put in place throughout the EU have led to a chain of effects severely impacting economic and social situations in the respective countries. Venue and visitor-based subsectors such as the performing arts and heritage were most severely hit. Furthermore, the crisis has highlighted the very vulnerable position of many non-standard workers in our sector, such as artists, freelancers, and temporary workers. However, the report notes that not all is doom and gloom. By default, creativity and innovation is the very nature, the very core of our sector. While the COVID-19 continues to impact heavily the sector, it also provides momentum to accelerate innovation and new business models. The question is whether our workers and organizations are equipped to jump on this wave of innovation. In Singapore, there was a 2-month lockdown. We called it the circuit breaker, lasting from April the 1st, it wasn't a joke, to June the 1st. It was followed then by a phased reopening, July the 1st, followed by a phased reopening and resumption of daily activities. Our government chose to err on the side of caution when it came to arts and culture activities. Venues with larger physical spaces, such as the museums and heritage centres, reopened in July with safety measures to ensure the well-being of visitors. Digital technology was used to get people to check in and check out, and temperature checks, mandatory masking for staff and visitors, as well as other limitations, gave people some amount of assurance that they would not be infected even as they continued to engage in culture. But for the arts, live performances which were held at performing arts venues and premises of orchestras, choirs, dance groups, and other arts and culture organizations, only resumed after the successful pilot of live performances trials in September 2020, not into 9 months after the disease was officially confirmed to have taken root in Singapore. However, audience capacity was kept at only 50 persons. Policy response that was undertaken in Singapore. To support the sector, the Singapore government responded with an expansionary budget comprising support measures for companies, individuals, and households. For the arts sector in particular, there was a 75 million in Singapore dollars, roughly the same in Australian dollars, an arts and culture resilience package. These aim to protect livelihoods in the sector, enhancing capabilities to prepare for industry disruptions and ensure that there was arts content available digitally for Singaporeans. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the different schemes that were quickly designed by my colleagues to help our art makers and our arts agencies. I'm sure many of these schemes were also put in place in other countries. What was then the role of research in this whole pandemic? For the NAC, the research priorities pre-pandemic was generally identified by reference to this schematic. Right at the center is the raison of the council, supporting arts making and fostering greater as well as wider engagement in arts and culture. As in other sectors, the activities of arts production and consumption rest critically on the types of infrastructure, whether physical and virtual, for showcasing, for rehearsal, for storage and documentation. It also rests on the educational training, not only arts makers, but also current and future audiences. And the third important pillar, or third important asset to drive arts making and arts engagement is the ecosystem of supporting organizations, institutions, and businesses. While the immediate output are the plethora of activities and events that give us respite during our humdrum days, there are medium and longer term benefits of arts engagement and arts making for us as individuals, for our increasingly diverse societies and in international relations. The economic impact of the arts can be somewhat sensitive phrase at certain platforms where those opposed to the instrumentalization of the arts gather, but not, I'm sure, at such a conference of cultural economics. But even if without the tech industries, the cultural and creative clusters are already contributing value added at various different levels. And the economic impact can truly be quantified to help us advocate for greater attention, whether in policy, funding, or philanthropy to the arts. So using this schematic and working together with our policy and program development colleagues, the NAC annually identifies key research questions and necessary research studies for the year. The shift that COVID-19 has sparked a focus on these three areas. A theme for this would be really addressing key life and livelihood issues. Should the pandemic become endemic to our days? Firstly, sustainability, the jobs and survival of the best arts organizations and of our freelancers and our employees within the arts organizations were truly at stake with the lockdown and with the dearth of tourists reaching our shores. So government needed to provide support until they could once again reach their markets. But what was the amount at which freelancers could continue to survive? What are the necessary types of support businesses and arts organizations need to tide out the days? These were questions brought to us by our policy colleagues. Then in terms of the science behind COVID-19 environmental mitigation measures, these scientific issues were something that we in the arts don't normally think of. But given the need to provide advisories and to to design a period in which arts organizations first, arts activities had to be stopped and then only resume in phases. There was a call for greater scientific basis for some of these decisions made. For well-being, lockdown had serious effects. There were opportunities for art to provide a respite, but COVID-19 also saw racism and anti-foreigner sentiment rear their ugly heads. So what could arts do to heal these societal fault lines? What could arts and culture bring to the a multi-ethnic, multicultural country like Singapore? And importantly, the people who were making arts to effect community well-being, how were they coping in the midst of the pandemic? And last but not least, digitalization. We urged our makers and our companies to pivot to gain new capabilities. But the question was, while we could give grants for them to produce, how do they monetize this? Will these have to be the new public goods that deserve public supports? So we have found evidence from our surveys that the online engagement in art did not cannibalize live performances, but during COVID-19, many had a taste of the great convenience of the digital. So a big concern for arts makers was, will they switch back? So new inequities and inequalities also arise. Whose consumption preferences should prevail? Whose consumption preferences are we even tracking in the first place? These three themes are not mutually exclusive. There are many issues that overlap both. For example, the digital divide could worsen access, leading to inequality of well-being within a country. So while our museums were pushing towards greater use of technology within the exhibitions, they also have to be mindful of the barriers that digital and virtual platforms might present. This access to technology differs among population groups, as do digital competency and literacy. These are findings, Indigo tells me, that have also been replicated and been found in Australia as well. So the near-term research aims presented to us by our colleagues and from other sectors was to quickly provide sense-making to support policy review and development. Secondly, to provide timely data to facilitate business and indeed artist transformation. 3, to consolidate scientific evidence to support safe management of venues and activities. And lastly, to truly evaluate the impact of all these policies and all these new practices that were adopted. Let's present some of the projects that we undertook in 2020. As an example of sense-making projects for policymakers and to provide timely data to our organizations on audience preferences, we ran 3 types of surveys. One was a survey on the impact of COVID-19 on the freelancers. Secondly, the impact of COVID-19 on arts organizations to understand what sort of new capabilities they need, what sort of new employment and size of workforces they would need coming back to post-pandemic revival. And thirdly, impact of COVID-19 on audiences. Then as an example, yes.
Sorry, Sharon, I might just jump in here because we're at 10 minutes. We'll come back to these questions in the discussion if that's all right.
Okay, that's fine.
Awesome. Thank you. That was fascinating. Some really great insights into the Singaporean context there, and really looking forward to teasing out the connections across our 3 case studies. So let's now move to Australia. So over to you, Rebecca.
Hi, thanks Indigo, and hello Sharon and Gab, good to see you. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded lands that I'm joining you from today, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the many nations that we're joining from today and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to Nations people online in this session. So I'll also start with a briefish summary of the COVID-19 situation in Australia and how it's impacted the arts. We had our first recorded case here in January 2020. In the second half of March, the Australian government announced increasingly restrictive bans on public gatherings and travel. National borders were closed to all non-residents, distancing rules were introduced, and all non-essential services were closed. So the immediate effect of those measures was that venues, theatres, galleries and festivals shut their doors and had to cancel programs and activities with very little notice, as was the case in many countries. And of course, there's been no international tourism, which has particularly affected those activities that attract large numbers of overseas visitors. We had an initial wave of infections in March last year, and after that, the number of cases fell and restrictions on events were loosened around the country. But then in July last year, cases began to rise again, largely centred in one state, in Victoria. And as Indigo could probably tell you, she's based in Victoria, heavy restrictions were reinstated there and continued for around 4 months. There have also been some periodic border closures in other states as various outbreaks have been identified and contained, and in some cases, smaller regions within states have locked down for a period of time. But largely from late last year until a few weeks ago, case numbers were very low in Australia comparatively. And many of the restrictions across different areas were lifted, which meant that doors really started opening again, as well as outdoor programming over our summer months. And that's up until a few weeks ago when the Delta variant of the virus started to be identified here. So in Sydney, which is where I am, we'll be going into our 3rd week of lockdown next week. At a national level, we're sitting at a total of around 31,000 cases since the start of the pandemic and 910 deaths as of yesterday. That's in a population of nearly 26 million. So we very much appreciate that we've been saved the large infection and death rates that many other countries have experienced. Our vaccination rates, however, are comparatively low. Around 25% of the population have had 1 shot and less than 10% are fully vaccinated. The reasons for that are the subject of much political and media debate at the moment, so I'm going to leave that one alone, other than to say that vaccination rates are likely to become more of a topic of discussion in the coming months in relation to impacts on programming and attendance. But what that arc of the pandemic in Australia to date has meant for the arts and cultural sector is a few things. Firstly, it's been experienced unevenly across the country. While Victoria was in heavy lockdown for 4 months last winter, many events were able to go ahead in other parts of the country, such as Western Australia and the Northern Territory. And those intermittent and unpredictable border closures and lockdowns have had 2 effects. Firstly, events have had to be cancelled midstream or at the last minute, including some large festivals. And it's also affecting the willingness of audiences to book things very far in advance. So that's kind of the overall context in Australia. There's a lot more happening at the individual and organisational level, and I'll come to some of that detail shortly. But I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. Not sure if that's working. Is that working, Indigo? Okay, I can't see it, but I'll just believe it's there. So yeah, moving now.
It might not be. Black screen on my end, actually.
Okay, I'll stop and start. Not about that. Okay, it's not going into slideshow mode, so oh, there, maybe that. Nope. Okay, I'll try one more time and then go without the slides. Sorry, everyone. Okay, I think I'll just leave it as it is, even though it doesn't look quite as pretty. So what we've been doing at the Australia Council, for those who aren't familiar with the Council, we're the Australian Government's principal arts funding and advisory body. And as Indigo mentioned, I'm the Director of Research, and the Australia Council has a legislated mandate to undertake research in the arts. Our research's agenda and priorities are driven by our corporate plan, and there are 5 strategic objectives set out in the corporate plan, which are those on the screen. Australians are transformed by arts and creativity. Our arts reflect us. First Nations arts and culture are cherished. Arts and creativity are thriving, and arts and creativity are valued. So all our research needs to align with one or more of these objectives. When COVID-19 hit, these objectives didn't change. They probably actually strengthened, but the mix of research we were working on did need to shift. And 3 priorities emerged for us in pretty quick succession. The first thing we turned our attention to was the immediate information needs of the sector. So that was took the form of a guide for artists and arts organisations to help them navigate their eligibility for the generalised national and regional support mechanisms that were put in place in response to the pandemic. And we did have some arts sector specific support packages, but they kicked in later in Australia. Our second priority was articulating those immediate impacts and the anticipated long-term impacts of the pandemic on the arts to help inform support and policies going forward. This is really an ongoing body of work that I think we're all doing. But at that critical moment, what it meant for us was aggregating the available insights, many of which were being generated by others. That ranged from data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics on arts and recreation business closures to the results that started to emerge from the Australian version of the I Lost My Gig survey. One of the really important pieces of research we produced at that time was analysis of the impacts for First Nations arts and culture. And as many Australians would know, the protection of First Nations communities from the pandemic has been a real success story here. There was a very serious fear that vulnerable elders may be lost, and that's been avoided to date by closing communities to visitors. But as well as being more susceptible to COVID-19 than non-Indigenous communities, First Nations communities have a much greater reliance on income from arts and cultural activity, particularly in remote areas with art centres. With many art centres closing their doors, that effectively shut off key revenue streams, as well as vital health and community infrastructure. So this piece of research drew on interviews as well as existing research and transcripts from a series of roundtable discussions that our First Nations team was hosting with First Nations artists and organisations. It was used at the time to inform discussions about what kind of support was needed, and it's still relevant and is still being drawn on. The major piece of research for us has been around audiences, and we embarked on the Audience Outlook Monitor, which is tracking audience behaviour and sentiment throughout the pandemic. It's a collaborative project with 5 state agencies and our research partners, Pattern Makers in Sydney and Wolf Brown in the US. The initial study involved 3 phases of data collection throughout 2020 in May, July and September, and we've continued with a further 3 phases in 2021. We've actually just gone into the field with phase 5 this week. Tracking over time has been important because it's given us insights into shifting behaviour and sentiment as those circumstances have changed. The sample is large. It ranges between 12,000 and 23,000 respondents at each phase. So we're able to provide results at the state and territory level, which has been really important because, as I mentioned, the circumstances have varied widely across different parts of Australia. One of the biggest changes to how we usually undertake research with this particular project was the speed at which results are turned out. And we talked to our research partners about this at the time. As researchers, we naturally want to sit with results for a while and really explore them and interrogate them before putting them out into the world. But one of the imperatives of this study was to get results out to people as soon as possible after collection, because that's when they need them, that's when they're trying to make decisions. The questions in the monitor, they kind of range from things like when people will feel ready to attend again, whether they've actually attended or purchased tickets, what sort of venues and seating arrangements and safety measures they're most comfortable with, whether they've been engaging with digital offerings, if so, have they paid for them and how much they've paid, and a range of other things. So we do monthly snapshots, and there's a few examples on the screen. We've also been hosting webinar discussions with guests speaking from the coalface. And there's also a dashboard available so users can explore the results themselves, and they can filter by demographics or things such as whether the person has experienced, that the respondents have experienced financial pressure as the result of the pandemic, or whether they live with a vulnerable person, or a number of other kind of filters can be applied. So just as an example of what we're finding, in the most recent results, the #1 barrier to attendance shifted from the risk of contracting or transmitting the virus to the risk of lockdowns and cancelled events. And that kind of makes sense with all of our lockdowns. We can see how things like the scheduling of mini seasons by many organisations this year are also aligning with the results that show audiences are tending to be making short-term commitments when they're booking tickets. So in the Australian context, this study has been really valuable, and it really actually, in the end, we didn't really know what would come, but in the end, it's actually been really kind of suitable for how the pandemic's rolled out and how the responses to the pandemic have rolled out in Australia. And so it's been useful for informing forward planning and to support decision making about when to reopen doors and resume programming and what to do in the meantime to stay connected to audiences.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rebecca. We might jump in there. And we'll pull out some of the connections that are already forming between our panellists, which is so exciting to see. I just want to respond to a couple of the questions that we're getting on the platform already, just around slide sizes. We just had a quick little technical glitch there. So we might try and see if we can circulate slides after the panel so that everyone can read them, if I'm just dobbing my panelists in for doing that. So we'll see whether they're willing to share before committing them to doing that, but that could be an option too. All right, now we're going to turn to Canada. Gab, over to you now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this panel, and thank you for ECI for inviting me to this presentation. I'm Gabriel Zamfir-Enache, Director of Research, Measurement and Data Analytics at Canada Council. Him, he, il, lui. I have to acknowledge that our offices and my home are located in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, on an unceded, unsurrendered territory of Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. COVID in international context is listening to my colleagues from Singapore and Rebecca, I have the feeling that I have to repeat what they said. The impact on society was equal everywhere in the world. The pandemic started with lockdowns, particularly and especially in Canada. In Canada, the public measures are under federal and provincial jurisdictions, so the measure in place put by the governments were different by province and at federal level, with a large direction in terms of borders and general health measures. Before the pandemic, and I think looking forward, it's important to mention it, in Canada, the Canadians valued art and culture as being part of well-being and quality of life. Art and culture contributed before the pandemic with almost 3% to the GDP, and I would say, sorry for my colleagues from sport, 10 times more than sports and social activities. So the art and culture in Canada during the pandemic, in my opinion, I think it was one of the sectors the most affected. And when I say affected, not only from economic point of view, but affected from the entire value chain, thinking to the professional development activities for young artists, and finish with the international touring of the large institution. It's one of the sectors when the pandemic disrupted everything. The creation activities itself, the engagement with the public, the added value to the public, thinking to art education for kids, activities for seniors, engagement with the public on the national level to touring and circulation of art exhibitions, international presence of Canadian artists, everything was disrupted. The big challenge that we have at this time is how the relaunch and the recovery of the sector will have. sorry. In the past year, the federal government, accompanied by provincial governments, invested a significant amount of money, the funds, to support the sector. First, in the first phases was to cover the cash needs of artists and group and organizations, provide additional support to individual artists, and in the last round of investments that was announced 2 weeks ago, to support the recovery and the relaunch of the sector. In this general context, I would like to say a few words, and I prepare a presentation for you today about Canada Council for the Arts, which is the National Arts Funders. And please give me a sec. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. I said the council is a national arts funders with a broad mandate to foster and promote the study and the enjoyment and production of works in the art. 2020-21 was a very particular year for Canada Council. Was a planned year to engagement with the arts community to put in place a new strategic plan 21-26. In the pandemic context, even the initial plans of the council was disrupted by the pandemic, and the engagement with the society and the arts community was repositioned from a digital participation point of view. In April, the council launched its strategic plan with 3 major directions: invest in rebuilding and innovation, amplify the benefits of the arts for the society, and nurture and expand collaboration and partnerships. In this context, for the council, what is the questions that me as director of research, I had to ask myself is, what is the role of the research, measurement, and data analytics section and the projects that we put in place to support the council in the implementation of the strategic plan. You can see on the slide our mandate sections that are focused on 3 major objectives: provide evidence base to the council, and this was very critical in the pandemic context; support shared knowledge, knowledge mobilization in the sector; and very important for the government and our society is to demonstrate the impact and promote the value of the public investment. Easier. In the context of the strategic plan, from research point of view, we develop new research initiatives that are aligned now with the strategic plan, and very important, incorporate an equity lens in our research that advance equity, diversity, and inclusion, anti-racism, and very important in the Canadian context, decolonization and support to Indigenous communities. Few area of research for the Canada Council research section: COVID-19 recovery and sustainability of the sector. Working with national and international colleagues, develop methodology and approaches to measure in real time the impact of the pandemic and how we can support sustainability of the sector long term. Impact of digital and new technologies in the art. It's one of the changes that we are facing now in Canada, and I think internationally, related to the capacity of the arts organization to engage with the public. Results of the council investment, as I mentioned before in the previous slide: decolonization, equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism, which is one of the priorities of the government and also Canada Council in strategic plan, and very important looking forward, innovation, creativity, and public participation in the arts. So these are the areas that were put in place as part of our research plan for the next 5 years. A few words about the recent research project. As mentioned in the part of on the slide of the section mandate, our role is to support the council with data and evidence for this decision-making process. One of the projects in this context, with this approach, was a survey, the largest survey that the Canada Council undertook to more approximately 30,000 recipients in the first weeks of the pandemic. And the role of that, the impact of that survey was quite large, helping the council and the government to put in place the first round of measures to support the sector, including, as I said at the beginning, cash needs, digital engagement, support the digital engagement, support the individual artists, and implement new funding initiative for digital presentation. Second one that I have, you can see on the slide the results of the first national survey put in place with our colleagues from the Department of Canadian Heritage as part of the first round of the funding to the sector by the federal government. And you can see the purpose and how the sector used those funds in the first the first 6 months of the pandemic. Was, in my opinion, was one of the measures that helped the sector to survive in the first 9 months of the pandemic through this initiative.
Gabe, just one more minute, if that's okay.
Yeah, I am almost again. Thank you. Very important for the large organization, us as a federal agency, is to understand their financial situation, how the COVID had an impact on their financial position, financial health. And we are using CADAC, which is the national database that collects financial data for more than 10 years and projections on financial health. I will share the slides with you, not a problem for the attendee. One of the great projects that we were able to put in place, and is the first for the council, is a decolonized research approach, engaging the indigenous community to demonstrate the value of the public funding for indigenous arts and culture. It's a large project over 2 years. Details are available on the council website. Path ahead for myself and my colleagues as a council is to obtain data, qualitative and quantitative, that support evidence-based decision for the next round of the funding, support the recovery in the sector, and of course, be able to demonstrate and continue to tell the story about the importance of art and culture for society at large.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel. It's been such a rich discussion already, and I'm really excited to start teasing out the connections and differences that we've heard about here a little bit further. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the panel, we'll start this discussion portion with some questions from me, where I will take full advantage of being chair and ask the questions that I am most interested in. But we will open it up to audience questions via the Q&A function. So please do start putting your questions in there, and I can see that we've already got a couple of really fascinating things to discuss soon. Now, I'd like to start with a question for the whole panel, and we might begin with Sharon before then turning to Rebecca and Gab's thoughts. So we've just heard 3 approaches to research within government's arts agencies, which, although dealing with the pandemic, dealt with really specific national context. And I'm interested in to what extent these specific national contexts are helpful in terms of collaboration across the federal arts agencies. or whether the specificities make collaboration a bit of a hindrance. Sharon, I wondered if you could reflect on the importance or otherwise of collaboration between agencies and how you've approached that during the pandemic.
Okay, I was going to end with I'm going to give a last try to showing my slides, because I did have one slide to talk about that.
Awesome.
Share screen. Do you see this? Can you see it?
Yay, yes.
Okay.
We can see your notes. You might want to go into presentation mode.
No, that's fine. Okay. And what I wanted to say was this, right? If there's an enduring lesson that we take away from the pandemic, is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And the scientific community has noted that, although people were it took 10 years in the past to arrive at certain research because of the lack of, will to share. Suddenly, because of the pandemic, within a single year, if you look at the chart, they had from end-to-end preparedness, they had manufactured infrastructure or mechanisms. And so I thought, how wonderful if one day cultural research could also enjoy this, right? So that we're not just coming together to talk and sigh about how it would be wonderful for us to share data, but it really happens in real time and very quickly. And so I'm really happy with this little community of ours, starting with us, Australia and Canada. And we've realized that, as we talk, that although we are on such different continents, the concerns of the clarity, the concerns of getting the public to really appreciate the full value of the arts, convincing advocates and colleagues in other ministries to pay a little more attention to us, it's a shared one, right? So I do think that something like this could be the beginning of a more wonderful relationship, and it starts with sharing the common data that we have. And as an econometrician, there are always ways to get around different contexts. It's called adding a dummy variable. And so if we could do that and build a huge data set, I think we'll be so much richer.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Thank you. Gab, what about your thoughts about international collaboration during this time?
It's one of the lessons, in my opinion, it's one of the lessons that we learned in the past year. The collaboration, share resources, national and international. It's one of the key factors that could ensure success of our research initiatives. In the past year, we put in place, and I have to say a big thank you to my colleague from Australia, Rebecca. We put in place a working group of some international arts funders from Australia, UK, New Zealand, and United States. I think those discussions help us to get a sense of the COVID impact in other countries, have opportunities to develop new approaches for our research, and very important in this context of decolonization of our thinking. It's might be very philosophical term, but it's rooted in the reality of our days. We have to be more respectful for other equity groups in our countries. We have to respect their cultural background to contribute to their access to funding and reduce inequalities in the sector. So at international level, having opportunities to work with other arts councils or arts funders help us to advance in our research agenda in the larger context. Nationally, I think it's very important to build new relationships, create partnerships and opportunities for collaboration with the national or at provincial or municipal level arts funders. Because from the high level, from Ottawa, it's hard to see always the reality in the field. So working with funders from the grassroots help us to put in place those measures that support the recovery and the relaunch of the sector. Last aspect, very important, is share experience about operational models that exists in the world. We had a great initiative with IFICA, with the International Federation of Arts Council, looking at peers assessment models in other arts funders to increase our internal capacity to deliver the grant in a more effective manner.
Amazing, thank you. And finally, Rebecca, what are your thoughts on the value of international collaboration between federal arts agencies? I know that you've just released a new report out of the Australia Council. There was a partnership with the Singapore Council.
We have, yeah. And I mean, firstly, I'd just echo what Sharon and Gab have been saying. And actually, Sharon and Gab and I have been catching up pretty regularly, as they've both mentioned, and also with other colleagues in other countries. And I kind of think that might be happening even without a pandemic, because it's just sort of what we're doing at the moment. But there is something actually kind of reassuring and valuable over this period to be able to get on a Zoom call and compare notes. And there are definitely similarities in what we're dealing with. Impacts of the pandemic, of course, on our various sectors, but also other issues around kind of equity as well. We're all kind of dealing with in our own national contexts. And even, I mean, there are very specific national contexts that where there are differences, but I suppose what I've observed is that we're all learning from each other and from what each other is doing, and we're doing some similar things, some different things. And maybe when we're doing different things, that can almost be a bit more valuable, if that makes sense, because sort of something about the sum of the parts being more. But we have been doing some specific collaborations. So we've got a couple on the go with Sharon and her team, and the report we released this week was around digital cultural engagement was one of them. One part. So the Australia Council took the lead on this part, but it was so valuable to have Sharon's team review the work and as it developed, and to include Singaporean examples throughout and to feed into it. Another international collaboration, the Audience Outlook Monitor, is actually an international study. So Wolf Brown in the US has been rolling it out in a number of places across the US as well as in Norway. And there have been a few like real benefits of that. Just having the experience of that Wolf Brown team, and also the pooling of resources has given everyone a bit more bang for their buck, which we all kind of need at the moment. And then that ability to be able to compare how different cohorts of people are responding to particular situations, because the situation in one part of the world might be a bit different to another part of the world. So that's really kind of adding a rich layer of to that body of evidence that's being built up through that project. You know, just so we can kind of understand the motivations and barriers for people in different situations in greater depth. And we are able to kind of go onto the dashboard and do some international comparisons. But yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Great answers. I want to kind of flip the conversation on its head now. We've talked about the research that was done during the pandemic. Now I'd like you to reflect on what wasn't done and why it wasn't done. Gab, we might start with you. Can you tell us about research that you would have liked to do during the pandemic but couldn't? And I'm especially interested in the consequences of this and whether we might be able to identify blind spots that policymakers are working with as a result.
Oh, yeah, it's a difficult question, and I have to be very careful how fast I respond, because I have a long list of projects that I loved the last year, and everything was put on hold. On a serious note, I think as a federal funder, arts funding agencies, it's our duty to get the data that support the measures to the sector. And when I think of the data, it's financial, here in a real time financial information about the impact of COVID that support us in implementing target funding initiatives for the sector, and the sector on the other hand as part of the knowledge mobilization to inform them and add value to their strategic plan. And I gave you an example. Financially, it's an economic conference. What are the needs of our organizations to reposition them in a new market. And then I know in our sector, the world market is hated, but it's a reality from economic point of view and marketing strategy point of view. How our organizations can be positioned in a new context at national level and international, because international stage, small orchestras from a city now is in a competition with large institutions from on international stage. So what strategies our organization can put in place to reposition them in a digital world? This type of research is that I like to do it. I hope we'll have the resources. And what is very important in this volatile context, to be relevant at this time, because the situation is changing so fast, so we don't have time to undertake large research projects. So it's one of the critical aspects of our research and evaluation measurement activity is to remain relevant for the funding, for the government, and for the community in our approaches.
Yeah, tremendous. Thank you. Sharon, can you tell me about, or would you like to add anything to this? And is there any data that we're missing in the Singapore context?
I mentioned that we had priorities and I had lots on my to-do list. Fortunately, because of the speed of the pandemic, I was not able to do many of these. If I could again show you my slide. So this is my sneaky attempt at being able to show my slides after not being able to show that. We go to this one. And I think key among that was really the science studies. We had like calls to be more scientific about our advisories and our guidelines, and we couldn't. There was just no time. And so we only could rely on international studies, and we could rely on those done by our Agency for Science, Technology, Research for other sectors. So really, our artists weren't very happy people, because they go like, that's ridiculous. I'm not spewing spittle all over the place. Why am I not allowed to do this? And we go like, sorry, that's the top research evidence that we have. So I would have liked to do a little more of those, but because of time. The other bit that we couldn't quite do was artist well-being. We knew that they were under lots of pressure, but to go interview different ones to really understand the trajectory, as we had like lockdown and opening and lockdown, the small little lockdowns again, that bit. And finally, the digitalization bit. For me, the big experiments that we needed to do was monetization. I could only infer evidence from that people say, I'm willing to pay, but I didn't know that whether if I offered something, they would actually pay for those. And the big perennial question was, if people get so used to free stuff and international stuff, will they ever come back full force to being attending live performance and exhibitions, and will they attend local Singaporean exhibitions now that they've got the best of the world? So much to do, so little time.
Big questions. Awesome. And Rebecca, in the Australian context, what kind of stuff are we missing that you'd like to get your hands on?
Well, all the things that Sharon and Gab just said, but I guess the thing that we felt the lack of the most here around the impact of COVID was just not being able to track the impacts for individual artists. We were able to get good information. There's a number of sources of information about what it's meant for organisations, but nothing really kind of comprehensive and robust for individuals with verifiable financial data. And part of that problem, of course, here, part of the problem for artists everywhere is that they're gig workers. And in the Australian context, we know from our last survey of practicing professional artists that David Throsby and Katja Petevskaya from Macquarie University undertake for the council. The vast majority of artists juggle multiple jobs. And in fact, we also know from that last survey, that around 40% identified in a non-creative occupation in the last census, because non-creative work was their main source of income in Census Week. So that placed real limitations on how much we could track the experiences of artists based on workforce data that was being put out by our Australian Bureau of Statistics. Lots and lots of anecdotal evidences, and same things that Sharon and Gab have said around the difficulty of not having robust data, even though we can see what's going on. So yeah, that's been the big one. We felt we are going back out into the field soon in early next year with that survey. So we will have some good data, I think, on after the fact on the impacts on artists, and I guess that will set us up for what might lie ahead, or even probably, sadly, the next pandemic.
Yes, yeah, scary point. I read a paper recently that started with 2020 as the first year of the pandemic, and it really brought it home. So before we turn to the audience questions, and there are some really exciting ones, I'm going to be selfish and ask one final chair question. I want to talk about the pivot to digital in the context of research and what that has meant. So in the same way as we've seen cultural practitioners and institutions move online, so too has research. And while this has come with a whole bunch of benefits, bigger sample sizes often, geographically distant participants, the digital divide remains a persistent and pressing challenge. And I wonder, the data that we're collecting is likely falling along some interesting fault lines there. It's very difficult to take part in digital surveys or interviews if you're on the wrong side of the digital divide. So I'm curious what this means for federal arts agencies and policy development based on this. Sharon, I might start with you.
If you have an answer to your own question, I'll be very happy to pay for it.
Let's talk.
We treasure our face-to-face surveys only because we definitely know the person is who you wanted to track. But we had no choice during the pandemic but to pivot to using online panels. And that was our worry as well, that we are only capturing those who are more educated, those who wanted to spend the time slowly clicking through the answers to the questions. And so we'll take the sort of wait and see approach. And so when we're able to resume face-to-face and have a look at how the sort of responses can compare, because there's always, within sampling, within survey, to sort of like weight up to the economies. But the sort of thought processes that someone goes through as he's doing digital survey versus a face-to-face, one doesn't quite know, right? So that's the thing. But that's an advantage sometimes, digital surveys, people are more honest compared to being, face-to-face with someone whom you feel a sort of desire to please, right? Yeah. The main challenge for inequities, yeah.
Yeah, great. Rebecca, can you tell me about how the Australia Council is thinking through the potential consequences of this data for policy?
Yeah, and we do often think that digital or online means greater access and greater participation. And for many people, that is the case. And we can see from our research that it does open up access for example, for many disabled people or people who don't live near major venues and for other reasons aren't able to attend. But we also know that I think it's over 2.5 million Australians are not online. And that connectivity is unevenly distributed across different groups. So in terms of how this applies to research methods and data collection, I think it's kind of a big ongoing question for the research sector. And I'd also really love to hear from some of the experts in the audience about what that kind of latest thinking is on how we can ensure we get representative samples. Because I feel like there's no one way at the moment. So I guess we're sort of doing mixed methodologies mostly. And that's what we did with the last arts participation survey. We did go with a predominantly online survey, and that got us a really big sample. And the consultants we worked with drew on 3 different panels so that they could sort of start target some of the harder to reach groups that we needed to make sure we had good representation of. But then that wasn't enough. So for some of the specific audiences that we wanted to make sure had an opportunity to participate in the survey, and that were likely to be unrepresented in online panels, we had to boost those with face-to-face interviews. and work with specialist consultants to reach those groups. And that's kind of always the case with First Nations people in remote areas. That's, I think, any kind of real research in that area is face to face. But we also use that methodology to capture the experiences of people with intellectual disabilities. And one thing we did actually do, it was still online, but we circulated the online survey in 6 different languages to reach Australians who aren't fluent in English as well. So, yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to hear from some academics about where should we be heading? Where will we be heading?
Yeah, great. And audience members, please feel free to start putting that advice in the Q&A if you've got something to say. Sharon, do you have something to add there?
I do wonder, though, with the prevalence of mobile, whether surveys that are pushed out through mobile platforms are a little more equitable compared to using the computer, because most people do use mobile phones. I mean, the problem just would be whether you have enough, you're in the vernacular that allows you to get their responses. I know there is a person doing app research, I think in probably Denmark or something, whether they can come up with apps that sort of like speak to you, right? If you don't want to sort of read that thing, to sort of trigger like a chatbot, ask you the question and allow you to record your responses. And that's sort of like it's a 21st century version of the telephone survey, right? So
yeah, I love that idea, using the affordances of the technology to push it forward. Gab, did you have anything to add about the Canadian context? I know Canada is grappling with many of the same infrastructural issues that Australia does due to the sheer size of our countries. Has this been a concern for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And we are operating in a context of the survey fatigue. So fatigue for us as agencies, having access to the data and use that data for decision making, but also the public who is asked, the individual artists that are invited to many surveys. So in this context of the survey fatigue, I think we have to ask those cultural aspects of research. We have the structural one related to how we engage digital capacity, but in my opinion, are fundamental cultural questions that we have to address. It's how we can be in contact with artists that are marginalized, how we can develop the trust with the community, how we can improve the privacy concerns of those communities in the self-identification process, because we have to recognize we are operating in a colonial model where the trust with marginalized communities is not there. So it's a work that we have to do to enhance that relationship with the community. We don't have, the council doesn't have equal access and collaboration with marginalized communities. So our priority at this point is to develop those partnerships and collaborations with representatives or with the communities that usually are not part of our clientele in the survey. We have to listen new voices, even that are tough against the government, in order to support them as a federal agency. Digital consideration is critical in this context. How we can support the sector in having access to internet. Even in Canada, there are communities in the north with limited access to internet. As agency, we have to put in place those mechanisms to enhance the capacity of our communities to have access to internet, to be able to have access to the funding, and also for us to be part of research point. A very important aspect that was revealed in the last year is the compensation. We cannot ask our artists to be part in research and evaluation projects for free. We have to be respectful for their expertise that we bring in our project and compensate their knowledge and effort. It's an additional cost that as a funding agency, we have to cover and recognize as respect for those communities.
Yeah, great points, Gab. Thank you. All right, let's open it up to audience questions. I might just, if anyone on the panel so far has a strong response, feel free to jump in with these questions. Otherwise, I will start delegating who's going to answer them. But the first question is from Daniel, and he's asking to what extent cultural and artistic organisations were committed to decreasing their environmental footprint before the COVID-19 pandemic. Is the post-pandemic context enhancing further efforts around environmental concerns in the cultural sector? Does anyone want to jump in on this one first?
I can come in. Yeah, I'll come in briefly. So we've been doing an evaluation on our international programs at the council over the last few months, and I guess that's where the environmental footprint is most obvious with travel, particularly because where Australia is placed, and part of that evaluation has been surveys and focus groups and data analysis. But some of the things that have come out in the conversation have been very much around how do we maintain our mobility without necessarily getting on a plane. So I think those artists and those organisations who are internationally engaged have been thinking about that for some time. And I agree with Daniel. Yes, absolutely. That inability to travel has really sharpened that, and it's some really interesting discussions, I guess, are opening up about how do you remain connected? What is kind of connection when we're not traveling, and what are the other ways that we can maintain that idea of mobility and international collaboration, which is critical, I guess, for many artists.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. And I think such critical conversations that are happening within the academy as well, around how we have those meetings where we used to go overseas kind of all the time. If it's all right with our other panelists, we might move on to another audience question, just I'm conscious of time. So Jen has asked, she says, it's great to get the point of view from federal arts funding agencies. Thank you to everyone. And she asks, has there been any change in what private sector support or sponsors of the arts are focusing on or valuing in pandemic times, do we think? Does anyone have any thoughts on shifts in funding practices? Gab, you've gone off mute.
Yeah, I can take a start with this question. It's very interesting, the reaction of the public sector. On one side, the sector as part of the large public recognize the value of artists or the importance of the artists on the society. Many artists gave us access to their creation, online access to their creation in the pandemic month and the lockdown. So that value was obvious for everyone. On the other hand, in my opinion, art and culture, and in Canada, a sector is facing a strong competition from other social sectors. The public donation, sponsorship, private funding now are in competition. What sector of the society, of the social life, we have to support as private institution, arts and culture versus support marginalized communities. So in my intervention, before I mentioned how we can support our organization to reposition them in a new volatile context, including marketing and strategy and fundraising. There are funds outside in other sector, in the private sector, but how we can give the capacity, create the capacity to our organization to have access to those funds and demonstrate the relevance and the value of what they are doing for the society at large.
Yeah, great. Rebecca, Sharon, do you have anything that you want to add to that question? Sharon?
I don't have data on corporates or the shifts in corporate funding, but what I've seen from my audience surveys were there were more people saying, I'm willing to pay for the arts, and Singaporeans are notorious for loving free things, because I'm concerned about the survival of the art and artists. And I think if this sort of like empathy for people who are essential but never perceived as essential continues, I think we are in a good place to up not just corporate, but individual philanthropy to the arts. But that's a good point. It's like we are really lacking in data. We also want to know what's the universe of funders, of people willing to give to the arts. Right? Yeah.
Big questions. Rebecca, anything to add on the Australian context?
Just one small thing. In the Audience Outlook Monitor, it had some interesting results around this, because obviously right at the beginning of the shutdowns, a lot of organisations started putting things online, and it was sort of about, let's just keep connected to our audience. And so they didn't really have the kind of the business models or the payment models established. But what they did kind of start with was, you can make a donation. And what we collected through the Audience Outlook Monitor was what was motivating people if they were paying for online access and online content, what was motivating them. And it really was at the beginning very much about, because I want to support this organisation or these artists, or they're in my local area. That was quite a primary motivation, and that's sort of shifting, I guess, over time, where people are wanting more out of the digital offerings. But it was interesting to see, I guess, at that initial stage, looking to the audiences themselves and their willingness to either forego what they had paid for tickets for events that were not going ahead anymore, and donating them to the organisation, or just being concerned about making sure artists were okay.
Yeah, such an interesting example of a shift away from, I suppose, philanthropic organisations to individual audience members as being a direct contributor to arts funding. Amazing. So we have one final audience question that I'd like to get through before we wrap up. So Meg Elkins says that she was on ABC Radio Sydney this afternoon talking about why Sydney-siders are not following the lockdown recommendations, which is a whole bunch of other things that we won't get into here. But her query around it is about how we might be able to nudge audiences to engage in the arts more. Are there nudges that we could use to remind us of the well-being associated with cultural participation? And Sharon, I can see you nodding here, and I know that this aligns with your interest in well-being. I wondered if you might start us off.
I should stop nodding. Okay, one big motivation for people to engage in the arts during the pandemic, from this sort of similar surveys to Audience Monitor, was novelty. People wanted to, and had the time to see things that they always wanted to, and had the boldness to look at things they wouldn't normally, because they don't have to pay for it. So novelty is a big sort of I think spur, and I think more experiments can be designed around how something different at a very low barrier of entry could be used to nudge people, and then to sort of grow their appetite from that. And I think the other point that I wanted to note was that we are so lacking in big data. We are still using surveys to ask people, and that's where we culture sector sort of lag behind the transport sector. So identifying, I don't know, where the behavioral points that I can get voluminous data that sort of point to some of these motivations. Yeah. Well-being was, yes, another one. And I think a lot more new, switches to digital art said that, they did so because of well-being. But then the key question for my arts companies would be, how long will these people stay? Are they fair weather or fair pandemic friends who are just to abandon me once they're free to go and exercise and go to the gym and all that?
Yeah. Gab, anything to add there?
Yeah, thank you. It's about that reposition. How we can, us as funders or as arts organization and artists, I can create new opportunities for me to engage with other sectors and create opportunities for collaboration and partnership. We saw in the last month great initiative from artists and organizations creating collaboration with the medical system for seniors with the schools in a more dynamic and digital context with art education activities for kids or even young students. So how art and culture create, the players in art and culture sector can create opportunities to work outside their bubble. We have to recognize in many cases we are tending to work among us and for us and with less opening from others. So is the time in this, I hope the pandemic will be over soon, to reinvent ourselves, to be more innovative, more creative, and very important, more respectful for the climate, which is, I didn't have the chance to talk about, but it's critical in this context to learn something after the pandemic, which is empathy, solidarity, and respect to the climate.
Beautiful, thank you. Rebecca, any ideas around how we might support our audience's well-being during this time?
Yeah, there were two things I was going to mention. One was, I guess, was around audiences are kind of, one of the things we've kind of finding is that people are willing to buy a ticket if they know, if on the day I just don't feel comfortable going, I feel a bit sick or I'm just a bit nervous, so can I convert that to an online, watch it online or kind of come back later, or and so I think that's probably a lot of organisations are offering those kind of exchanges, refunds, that flexibility. So it's sort of about getting the digital models right so that it can facilitate different modes of being able to engage depending on where people are at on any particular day. But yeah, I was also going to say we've been doing a lot of work and having a lot of conversations around the role of arts engagement for mental well-being, mental health and well-being, and it's a huge topic at the moment. Obviously, we're coming through a pandemic where people are struggling with mental health, but we've also come out of the back of a horrible bushfire season, and there is a bit of a kind of an epidemic of mental health issues in Australia, I'm sure around the world. And I think we're at a moment where there is a real focus of interest on going beyond the sort of medical approaches and looking at how things like arts engagement can really support that kind of whole of life well-being. So we've got a real opportunity at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Gab, come on.
My apology, I forgot to mention one important aspect is that we have to consider in our strategy and our organization is what is the future of work of our audience. If our audience, we came back to their office in downtown as they did before the pandemic, or if they work remotely. If they work remotely, how we can make your audience to came from their home office to downtown. So it's a change in the customer behavior from marketing point of view. It's how we can engage with the audience in the new context of their of work and entertainment that is completely changing in this context.
Absolutely. And I think the shifting temporalities of this work is so fascinating, particularly when you're doing live stream or time-based windows in which to watch something. The whole timeline of cultural engagement is changing and extended out in so many interesting ways. Massive, huge questions to be dealing with. We've got a couple more comments and questions in the audience Q&A. So Dorota has said that there was a research study on theatre artists in Poland, which was a representative sample, and showed that even if there were some problems with communications with artists, government was the leader in providing public help aid to artists when local governments and private sector activated later and rather in an ad hoc way. We've got 5 more minutes left. I'd like to give our panelists like 30 to 45 seconds, so a very small, quick pitch, to tell a room full of researchers what's your dream research agenda? Blue skies, what kind of research do you want to see the room full of cultural economists and associated researchers tackling? Rebecca, I might throw to you first. Blue skies, dream big, exciting things.
Oh, that's a treat. Thank you, Indigo. One really kind of specific thing I would love if someone could grapple with those various Australian Bureau of Statistics data sets that look at multiple job holdings, because it feels like there's a whole lot of answers to many of our questions in that, sitting in those data sets that you know, if we can get the key, we might be able to unlock some really useful data. One other thing I think, which is sort of at the other end of the scale, is a perennial challenge for arts agencies is tracking long-term impacts, either of an investment by an arts agency or the long-term impact of an artwork itself. And they're difficult, obviously, because how do you isolate the contribution of one thing from all the other contributing factors that come after? But it'd be great to hear if anyone has some kind of new or innovative approaches to that question. And just if I've got, do I have any more seconds left? One other area that's of interest for us at the Australia Council is we're wanting to ensure that going forward our research is informed by Indigenous data sovereignty and decolonization, as Gab was talking about in Canada. So we're kind of in the process of seeking advice, and we very much welcome approaches from First Nations researchers out there who are working in this area.
Awesome, thank you. All right, Gab, super quick. What's your dream research agenda?
Yeah, the value of the arts constantly change according to the needs of the society, communities, and individuals. The question for us in research is how do we reflect these changes in our work and make the diverse engagement to the arts and the value as a key player in the development of society. So the impact studies, the value of the art is a critical. And also I have to mention that it's a big difference between the value of the art that never should be confused with the value of the art sector that is broader and includes economic context.
Right.
And
I'll just
understanding
throw to Sharon because we're nearly out of time. Sharon, what's your dream agenda?
Longitudinal analysis of audiences and artists, tracking them from birth to, you know, whatever, so that I truly know what's happening inside their heads and hearts.
Oh, I love that. I love that. All right, we are officially at the end of our session. Thank you so much to our brilliant panelists, Sharon, Gab, and Rebecca. I'd also like to thank Kristen Cornell from the Australia Council for all her work in organising this panel and for inviting me to be part of it. It's been such a joy. Thanks also to our wonderful audience for joining us and for contributing such insightful questions. We hope you get as much out of the discussion as we did and you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.